Week 15 waiver wire additions. We're talking about players you can add this week for your fantasy football playoff run. Some of you are sitting on bye weeks and you don't have to play a game this week. Others are competing here in week 15. So for the ones that are competing in week 15, there might be some players this week that need to go into your fantasy football lineup. For others, we're stashing these players. And one other factor comes into play in the fantasy football playoffs, and that's playing defense with the waiver wire. There's only 5 other teams you're competing against, 6 total teams in most fantasy football playoffs. So you have an opportunity to prevent your opponents from adding a valuable piece to their roster. So if you have more fab than someone and they really need something, and maybe you don't, maybe they need an RB2 this week, and you don't, you still want to be able to outbid them and prevent them from getting what they need to make their lineup stronger. The fantasy football playoffs, waiver wire runs are not just about your roster, but it's also about playing defense, preventing your league mates from getting a piece that is not only potentially valuable this week, but could have a role that's growing and ascending. And there's a couple guys like that this week for week 15. Where it's looking like their trajectories are pointing upwards. So you see it every year in the NFL. Some younger players break out towards the end of the season, and oftentimes you'll see players get injured and other players take their place and run with it. This is an opportunity league. You need those touches to score fantasy points. It's all about touches this time of year. We saw it last week with Zach Charbonnet. Charbonnet got his chance. This is the third time this year that Zach Charbonnet has had the backfield all to himself. He's averaged 27 points per game in his 3 games, over 80% snap rate. So you've seen it with multiple positions where a waiver wire guy can come in and help you win the week. And only 3 weeks to play here, this becomes even more important. Now, this show, I'm concentrating on players that are available to you in 70% of leagues or more. There's plenty of shows out there that are going to talk about guys, and you're going to say, well, you know, those guys have been rostered in my league since like August. There's no way that guy's going to be available to me. This show, I'm talking to people in competitive leagues. I'm talking to people in deep leagues, and I'm talking to the fantasy football manager that needs an edge in a league that's difficult to pick up players off of the waiver wire. So I'm going to specifically look at players available to you in 70% of leagues or more. But we're going to take a quick moment to look at a few players that are available to you in 60% of leagues or more. These are sort of shallow league ads, if you want to call them that. And let's start out with Cedric Tillman. As of Monday, and I'm recording this Monday in the late afternoon. I usually would record this on Monday morning, but StreamYard, my recording software, was out. So you're getting this pod a little bit late, and you're getting the show. If you watch it on YouTube, it's coming out late. Everything's sort of late, but we're still going to get it in. So Cedric Tillman is still in the concussion protocol. He's available in 66% of leagues. Tillman's expected to return soon. He posted 3 consecutive top 12 weekly finishes from weeks 7 through 9, and he had 18 points in each of those games, 18.1 points or more in each of those games. So Tillman has thrived alongside Jameis Winston this year, and he might miss another week, but he's a player you can stash if you want to chase it in week 16 and week 17. Marquez Valdez-Scantling, available to you in 62% of leagues. MVS scored 9.1 points last week, but he was targeted 7 times, which is a positive for a guy who gets these downfield targets. He led all Saints wide receivers in targets. This week, the Saints go up against the Washington Commanders. Washington coming off of a bye week. This might be a game where New Orleans is trailing and they have to take a few extra shots downfield to MVS. Wan'Dale Robinson, available to you in 65% of leagues. I'm not too interested in this one. This is one where I feel like you're chasing a floor. I'd rather chase a ceiling, but Robinson did have 11 targets in week 14. Romeo Doubs, available to you in 62% of leagues. Let's keep an eye on Doubs if he was dropped. This week, you're not going to use him. But down the line, Green Bay plays New Orleans and Minnesota in week 16 and week 17. So Doubs could potentially be a gut shot flex play if you get into injury trouble in week 17. That matchup against Minnesota, could be an over environment. We just saw it with Green Bay when they went up against Detroit. It was like a 34-31 game. That Minnesota Green Bay could tilt that way as well. Jameis Winston, available to you in 66% of leagues. Winston struggled in week 14, but he still threw 2 touchdown passes. This is a player that has continually put up really strong numbers. Had a couple of games where he struggled, but Winston overall has been very solid. Heading into Monday Night Football's game, Winston was still a high-end QB2 on the week. So Winston was a guy where you watch Sunday's game and you're like, he's got 2 picks. But again, for the weekly scoring, Jameis Winston ends up finishing almost inside of QB1 land. So Winston's a guy where we've seen what the massive spike week looks like. We saw it against Denver. He had the exceptional amount of passing yards, 497 passing yards. We saw it against New Orleans, 395 passing yards. And we saw it against Baltimore, where he had 3 touchdown passes. So this is a player where if the game shoots out, this could be a player that could really help you. And Cleveland in week 16 plays Cincinnati. That could be an over environment on the road in Cincinnati. Joe Burrow against Jameis Winston. That should be a lot of fun and one that could really help fantasy managers. And the last player to talk about, Tyler Algier. We talked about Charbonnet earlier in the show. Now, I don't think Tyler Algier would score at the level that Charbonnet would, but in terms of handling that many touches, handling 20-plus touches, if Bijan Robinson missed a week, Algier could handle 20 touches. He is one of the better handcuffs to roster because he would give you that high-volume role if Robinson were to miss a week. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends, and wide receivers for you to pick up and use this week in week 15 or to stash for your fantasy playoffs down the road in weeks 16 and 17. This is Waiver Wired.
Oh, every week I'm answering these start-sit questions on Sunday morning. I go to the weekly rankings on playerprofiler.com just to make sure that my instincts are correct, and sometimes they're not. And guess what? More often than not, I go with the projections. You may not feel great about starting Daniel Jones or Wan'Dale Robinson, but the projections say, hey, that's the move. It may not feel right, but you use those projections to get it right. That's the power of the Player Profiler system. It's Evan Ringler, it's Bradley Stalder, it's Theo Gremminger, of course, it's Billy Muzio making these rankings possible. The season rankings, so you know who to pick up, who to trade for. The dynasty rankings are part of this. The offensive line rankings from Dan Fornick, one of the best in the business. Then we get our cornerback rankings, which show which corners are matched up with which wide receivers. And now, in collaboration with the IDP show, we have IDP rankings. Did you know that? Did you? So go to playerprofiler.com, use promo code PODFATHER. Get you 25% off the player rankings package right now at playerprofiler.com. Enjoy!
Welcome back. We're talking about Waiver Wire Week 15. I'm Theo Gremminger. If you're watching this show on YouTube, make sure you hit the like button. If you're listening to it on the podcast, make sure you're subscribing. Both of those things don't cost you anything. They help us out a great deal. Let's talk about the quarterback position. Not too many QBs to talk about. Most of the good ones are rostered higher than our percentage. It makes them available. Talk about Drake May. Drake May is a player that makes for a perfect QB2 for you to roster. He's also a player that if I'm going up against somebody who's struggling at QB, I want to block them from getting Drake May. Drake May is available to you in 87% of leagues. Last time we saw May, he was a quarterback 10 in week 13. He had 297 total yards, including 59 on the ground. Every week that Drake May has started and played the entire game, he's finished between QB 10 and QB 18. So he's had that low-end QB 1 or solidly high QB 2 kind of baseline for his starts. But with his scrambling ability, he's a wild card that could pop off for a one-game slate. You're talking about a guy who has had a 95 rushing yard game, and we just saw him with a 59 rushing yard game. So despite a lack of pass catchers, despite a lack of an offensive line, Drake May is producing for fantasy. Talk about Bryce Young. Bryce Young came down to earth this past week against an Eagles defense. This was sort of expected. Young made a few nice plays, but he failed to crack 200 passing yards for the first time since Carolina's bye week. Finished as a QB 8 overall in week 13, and he was QB 14 and QB 17 in the 2 weeks prior. This week, Carolina faces off against an easier opponent like in Dallas, but for for Bryce Young, the reason you would roster him is a potential Week 17 game against Tampa. He's definitely on the Superflex radar, but again, he had QB8 performance against Tampa Bay 2 weeks ago. Week 17, he gets them again. Cooper Rush, available in 95% of leagues. Cooper Rush is simply a Superflex consideration. Then you have Desmond Ridder. If you're in a Superflex league, every starter has value. Desmond Ridder gets a revenge game against his old team, the Atlanta Falcons, this week. Aiden O'Connell is on the injured reserve. Ridder has enough mobility and enough talent that he could put up a decent line this week against Atlanta. And this is one where I don't want to give an opportunity to a manager that really needs a quarterback to pick up Ridder. So I'd be willing to block them. And even if you don't use Ridder, you want to cut him down the line, pick him up for this week so that other manager doesn't have the opportunity. Use your fab sort of as a weapon this week. Know what your opponent needs. Know how much fab they have left. And when you have an opportunity to block them on something they might need, go ahead and do that. Running back position, we got a lot to talk about. And we're starting to see the backup running backs get opportunities. We've seen multiple injuries coming into fruition. We've seen multiple opportunities for new players. And we already mentioned Zach Charbonnet. We talked about Algier earlier. This is a league where guys break down, and you're starting to see these next opportunity players step in. This past week, you saw Zach Charbonnet for Seattle. You also saw Isaac Guerendo for San Francisco. And Guerendo was our number one ad last week, and Guerendo scored 28 PPR points. And unfortunately, Guerendo exited the game with a foot injury. His situation is up in the air, but we want to err on the side of he's going to miss this week. And we want to aggressively try to add Patrick Taylor, the next man in San Francisco. Taylor had 7 carries for 25 yards and scored a touchdown. He would be the next man in, a almost full-time back in San Francisco. Wild how this has worked out. Goes from the 4th-string running back to the 1st-string running back potentially this week. And Patrick Taylor should be our top waiver wire ad. I'm going to reveal my top 10 overall shortly. Then you've also got Sincere McCormick. McCormick is getting RB2 usage right now in Las Vegas. The reason I don't have McCormick ahead of Taylor is because the quality of the offense. I believe more in San Francisco's offense than I do the Las Vegas Raiders. But McCormick is producing. He had 89 total combined yards this past week. He had 18 touches this past week. Amir Abdullah was a non-factor. For the second consecutive season, Antonio Pierce is using a lightly used running back. Towards the end of the season, we all saw what Zamir White was able to do down the stretch. Sincere McCormick is going to get the similar usage. So Sincere McCormick should absolutely be an aggressive addition for you. Prevent someone in your league from being able to pick him up and having a plug-and-play potential RB2. When you go to 18 touches, you're only a few extra touches away from being like a 25-touch player. Anyone in the NFL at running back, if you give him 25 touches, can be fantasy viable. Jaleel McLaughlin, he's available to you in 87% of leagues. Call this one a hunch. I think coming out of a bye week, Denver may turn to McLaughlin in an expanded role. Javonte Williams not getting it done. If we take away that New Orleans game, there's pretty much been nothing of note for Javonte. And Javonte this past game was sort of boxed out for McLaughlin. McLaughlin had 85 combined yards in week 13, that wild game against Cleveland. But McLaughlin also has ability as a pass catcher. So is it going to be a weird split where Javonte Williams and Audric Estime each get so many touches that like McLaughlin's unusable? Or could it be that Denver actually goes with McLaughlin in sort of an elevated role? I think it could be the latter. So I'm going to be aggressive with McLaughlin this week, and this is one where I could be totally wrong. Kendre Miller, available to you in 96% of leagues, scored a hard-fought, like, rushing touchdown. Darren Rizzi likes Kendre Miller, so the whole narrative about, like, Dennis Allen doesn't like Kendre Miller, Dennis Allen's gone. Dennis Allen catches another L on not liking Kendre Miller, because Kendre Miller looked good last week. 10 carries for 32 yards and a touchdown. He's absorbed the Taysom Hill vacated carries, and he has contingent upside if Alvin Kamara were to miss a game. Isaiah Davis, available to you in 98% of leagues. Davis cracks my top 10 overall. Braylon Allen actually played pretty well. Braylon Allen led New York running backs in touches, but it was really a split with him and Isaiah Davis. And for the second week in a row, Isaiah Davis scored a touchdown. So even in a split backfield situation, Isaiah Davis is one where I can use him because the Jets are going up against Jacksonville, a pretty terrible team this week. So last week it was Isaiah Davis with 10 carries, and he was targeted 6 times. Braylon Allen had 11 carries and was targeted 5 times. So really an identical number of targets and carries, but Davis was the one who scored the rushing score. So Davis has won two touchdowns in a row. 2 weeks with a touchdown in a row. He needs to be in my top 10 overall this week, and he is. Ray Davis. Davis was boxed out for touches this week. The game flow dictated Ty Johnson, but we know if James Cook were to miss a game, Ray Davis would be the next man in. In the one game where James Cook missed this season, Ray Davis had 150 combined yards. So this is a player where, much like a Zach Charbonnet, much like a Isaac Arendo last week, this is a contingent upside stash in case James Cook misses. And if you're a James Cook manager, go ahead and pick up some Davis. Protect your investment with the Buffalo RB1. Blake Corum, available to you in 84% of leagues, back-to-back games with 8 carries. A valuable stash because of the quality of the offense and the role he would have if Kyren Williams were to miss a game. Blake Corum would be an instant top 15 running back start if Kyren Williams were to miss a game, and he's playing better and getting more volume than he had earlier in the season. Justice Hill, Derrick Henry's primary handcuff running back, available to you in about 85% of leagues. Trey Benson, available to you in 79% of leagues. Now, Benson's one where people will point at Amari DiMercato, and I certainly think Amari DiMercato would get touches, and Amari DiMercato actually had more touches than Benson this past week. So this is sort of a Ray Davis, Ty Johnson situation where Arizona was trailing. Amari DiMercato they use in passing down situations. DiMercato gets 4 receptions. Trey Benson gets like 1 catch, gets 2 carries, does nothing. But if James Conner were to go down, Trey Benson would be the next man in Arizona. And Kamani Vidal is one whose role is expanding. Vidal played more in week 14 than he did in week 13. Gus Edwards still scored the rushing touchdown. Gus Edwards still saw the majority of the touches. But Kamani Vidal is a speculative addition, and this week could be his breakout game against Tampa Bay. He makes my top 10 overall additions. Jalen Wright, available in 95% of leagues. Raheem Mostert is dealing with a hip injury. Jalen Wright, consider him to be the handcuff to Devon Achane. Cam Akers, available to you in 84% of leagues. The primary handcuff back to Aaron Jones. Nothing more, but he is a handcuff to Aaron Jones. If Jones missed, Akers would be on the RB2 line. A new one to discuss, Sean Tucker. Sean Tucker had 3 carries for 47 yards. Bucky Irving was dealing with a hip. Bucky Irving's also dealing with something with his back. So Bucky Irving is banged up. Bucky Irving has been tremendous, but if he misses, Sean Tucker has value behind Rachaad White. We've also seen Sean Tucker have a smash game this season. If you recall, Sean Tucker had an RB1 overall week earlier in the year. Wide receivers, we're talking about Elijah Moore. We mentioned Cedric Tillman earlier. I want to chase the Cleveland Browns Jameis Winston situation. I want his pass catchers on my bench. And with Elijah Moore, we saw him score 15 points in week 11. We saw him score 15 points in week 13. He's had 8 or more targets in 4 out of his last 6 games played. So he had a quiet one last week, but Elijah Moore is one where if I'm in a jam, I would rather chase using a Jameis Winston wide receiver who's had a couple of decent scoring games than one of these floor play guys with really no ceiling. Josh Palmer, available to you in 84% of leagues. Palmer stepped up with Ladd McConkey sideline, led the Chargers with 9 targets, and he caught 6 passes. He had 6 catches for 78 yards. Both of these were season highs. If Ladd McConkey misses another game, Palmer would be like a viable flex play. Maybe a wide receiver 3 if you were really in a jam in a wide receiver heavy format. Dontavian Wicks, we talked about Romeo Doubs earlier. Wicks played pretty well against Detroit. 4 catches for 49 yards. Depth piece, wide receiver for you. Xavier Legette. Legette is one where it's really the Adam Thielen show. But if you're in a deep format, Legette has had 8 targets in back-to-back games. Did nothing against Philadelphia. Ray McLeod cracks my top 10 overall. Available to you in 82% of leagues. He's been targeted 23 times over his last 3 games played. He's recorded 12 catches for 95 yards and 98 yards. So 12 total catches over the last 2 weeks. He had a 95-yard game and a 98-yard game in back-to-back weeks. So this is a player that is trending up despite having wide receiver teammate competition. McLeod is playing well. Jalen McMillan, available to you in 95% of leagues. McMillan had his breakout game as a pro, scored 2 touchdowns, a 15-yarder and a 29-yarder. McMillan, of course, was the 3rd-round pick for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in this NFL draft. A very hyped player this summer, had a great preseason, and I had him as the top waiver wire ad when Chris Godwin went down. That certainly didn't work out, but maybe that was just being early, and Jalen McMillan finishes the season well. McMillan is one who certainly looks like he's trending up. He makes my top 10 overall. Michael Wilson, available to you in 91% of leagues. A deep option if you're in a very wide receiver heavy format or a very deep league. Wilson has had 3 straight games with 54 yards or more. He had a 41-yard touchdown grab against Seattle this past week. Demario Douglas, sort of like we talk about with Wan'Dale Robinson. I don't love making these kind of plays in the fantasy playoffs. This is more of a bye-week fill-in guy than a swing for the fences dart throw. But Demario Douglas has had 4 catches in 5 straight games played. Talking about Tim Patrick. Tim Patrick for Detroit. This is a little bit of a sleeper. He's had 43 or more receiving yards in 3 consecutive weeks, and he had 2 touchdown catches on 6 receptions in Detroit's big win over Green Bay. Probably can't trust him, but he could be one to stash. Now, this is a really fun one. We'll wrap up wide receivers with Hollywood Brown. Hollywood Brown's available to you in 81% of leagues. Hollywood Brown hasn't played all season long, but the Chiefs are eyeing a Week 16 debut. And this Chiefs offense has been stuck in the mud in multiple weeks, and they're sort of doing everything they can just to get by. They could really use a spark from a wide receiver like Hollywood Brown. So there is a chance that Hollywood Brown might do enough in Week 16 that you would consider using him in Week 17. That wraps up the wide receivers. Let's talk about tight end. Last week, I had Jawan Johnson as a top 10 overall addition. Johnson had a touchdown catch this past week, and he's going to return to the top 10. He has had 9 catches for 86 yards and a touchdown over his last 2 games played. He is on the field pretty much the whole time. He's absorbed the Taysom Hill targets, and he, with the lack of wide receivers in New Orleans, he's one of their most reliable pass catchers. He plays the Baltimore Ravens this week. This is a positive matchup for him. Noah Gray. Noah Gray is available to you in 79% of leagues. He played 62% of the Chiefs' offensive snaps this past week. So although Travis Kelce's out on the field, Noah Gray has sort of been in his role for like 4 straight weeks now. He's had 4 straight games with 4 catches. Now, in 2 of those games, he had 2 touchdowns in them. He had those back-to-back weeks with 2 touchdowns in each game. But really, it's Noah Gray is sort of if I get in a bind at tight end and I'm looking to chase it, they play the Cleveland Browns later on in the fantasy football playoffs. And this is a game where the Browns have been very generous against opposing tight ends. Isaiah Likely, available to you in 78% of leagues. Likely sort of a handcuffed tight end for Mark Andrews managers, but he'd be an instant tight end 1 if Andrews were to miss a game. We've seen him also be productive alongside Andrews recently. He had a 4 for 75 line in week 11, and he had 5 catches for 38 yards and a touchdown in week 13. And he had a goose egg sandwiched in between, a straight up 0 in week 12. Staying at the tight end position, we got to talk about a couple of sleepers. Stone Smart for the LA Chargers. This is a player with Will Dissly banged up. Stone Smart is going to get his opportunity. This is a deep sleeper player, a very athletic tight end. But Stone Smart's a fun start. Like if you're in a tight end premium format, you're really struggling at tight end and you need to chase it. This has been a role that has been valuable at times, the tight end position in the Chargers offense. Plus you have Ladd McConkey potentially missing another week. Dissly's going to miss. McConkey could miss. Smart could be on the field a ton. And he had 3 catches for 54 yards on Sunday. This is a player who was a former quarterback who converted to wide receiver, then converted to tight end. Keep an eye on Stone Smart if you're in a tight end premium format or a deep league. Grant Calcaterra. Grant Calcaterra is available to you in 96% of leagues. He scored a touchdown in Philly's win over Carolina. He's playing a full-time role as a Dallas Goedert replacement. Keep an eye on Calcaterra. Now I'm going to give you my top 10 overall additions. These are the players, how I would value them on my waiver wire if I was ranking them. And again, all of these players are available to you in 70% of leagues. Patrick Taylor, number 1. Check the Isaac Guerendo news. If Guerendo looks like he's going to play, then Sincere McCormick would move up to number 1. So number 1, Patrick Taylor. Number 2, Sincere McCormick. Number 3, Elijah Moore. Number 4, Jawan Johnson, my preferred tight end. Number 5 is a tie. Jaleel McLaughlin and Kamani Vidal. Number 6 is Isaiah Davis. And really that whole cluster of McLaughlin, Vidal, and Davis could all be together. If I needed one for this week, it's Isaiah Davis. But there's a chance with Vidal and McLaughlin that they are the preferred backs and getting a higher volume than Davis. I think Davis is going to be in a split. And if Breece Hall returns, that's going to sort of ruin everything with that narrative. Jalen McMillan at number 7. Ray McLeod at number 8. Drake May at number 9, my favorite quarterback this week. And Blake Corum at number 10 because of his contingent upside. Once again, Patrick Taylor at number 1. Sincere McCormick at number 2. Elijah Moore at number 3. Jawan Johnson at number 4. Jaleel McLaughlin at number 5, tied with Kamani Vidal. Isaiah Davis at number 6. Jalen McMillan at number 7. Ray McLeod at number 8. Drake May at number 9. And Blake Corum at number 10. I'm Theo Gremminger. Make sure you come back later in the week. I'm going to drop a Sleepers podcast. More stashes for you in the fantasy football playoffs. Look for way more fantasy football playoff content. I'm going to be putting it out every single week. Get you covered with your defensive options. I'm going to have some good guests on these pods. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit the like button. And if you are listening to this on the podcast, make sure you are subscribed to our podcast. It helps us out a lot and it costs you nothing. Let's crush it in the fantasy football playoffs. This has been a good year for us on this show with the waiver wire additions that we've been able to add. Let's crush it. We got to win 3 games in a row for some of you. Some of you only have to win 2 games in a row. Let's go get that title. Let's go get that money, and let's finish this season right.
From the Podfather to you, I deeply appreciate you tuning in. And many ask, what can I do? What can I do to help support the host, the research they do, the production costs? Go to playerprofiler.com, Dynasty Deluxe, World Famous Draft Kit, Rankings, DFS Dominator, and of course, data analysis. Subscribe to any one of those, and you support all of us and take Player Profiler to the moon.